Good morning and welcome back. It's Michael, Kate and Sally again talking about leadership in organizations. And today we want to talk about the great return to work that might or might not be about to happen. And I guess part of what we're talking about is what's the culture that's going to exist in the new world. And it's Monday morning. Schools in England go back today. Schools in Wales, I think, go back next week. We're beginning to see movement towards people coming back into the workplace on a more permanent basis. But what's that going to be like? And what's the culture going to be like? Sally, do you want to give us your very simple definition of culture? Because inherent in that definition is an issue, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there is an agreed definition, but quite a lot of people will think of culture as the way we do things around here. One of the reflections that I've had is the around here part of that, not just the way we do things, because lots of organisations would have worked on developing a really supportive and positive culture in the years leading up to the pandemic. But of course, the assumption there is that people are all in the same workplace generally. So that the symbols and signs that people see around the place that suggest what the culture is, you can almost feel it in some offices. Has developed because everybody's together. So there's a way of doing things that, people just sort of pick up and become used to. And one of the reflections that I had is that once we started to see that around about 50% of the UK workforce were now working from home.
And Sally's just lost us. The first technical glitch we've had. Sorry, Sally, we lost you there for a second. 50% working from home, you said.
Yeah, so in the UK, around about 50% of people have been working from home during the pandemic. And one of the reflections that I had is what happens to an organisation's culture when its staff are virtual, when they're not in the workplace, seeing those signs of, what the culture should be, just in terms of the values being on the wall, or perhaps other symbols and signs that they might have seen around the office. So I'm interested to know perhaps what has happened to culture, whether organisations have been able to ride on a positive culture and that's helped them flourish during the pandemic because they've shown greater levels of compassion and support for people, or actually whether the culture in organisations has started to fracture. And I suppose the question we might ask ourselves is, does that actually matter? Well, I do think it matters now as organisations are starting to wonder about what is the future of work. Do we bring people back into the office 5 days a week? Or do we start to look at some sort of hybrid model? And I think it's really important that organisations start to ask the questions around what is right for the future of work and the future of their workplace, both for the employees, but also for the customers, for the users of their service. So I think there's a lot to be thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, you've just opened up a whole week's worth of debate, I guess, in what you're saying. Kate, there is a balance, isn't there, between what the organization needs and customers need, etc., and what the individuals need. What's your perspective on what we're talking about?
Well, listening to you, Sally, I think there's been a lot of support for the people and the human resources in organisations over the last year. And that's been really evident just in all of the information we've been getting. And I think what will now take precedence probably is the priorities of the business. So what's going to be viable for the business in terms of meeting customer needs, delivering what's needed for the organisation. So those kinds of financial decisions about how things are going to work from that perspective going forward is probably going to take precedence over just the human resources. So we know that organisations are having to make decisions about office space, about headcount, and some people I know are really tied up in talking about redundancies, sadly. Lots of people have been on furlough for a year. What will happen when that ends? So I think there's going to be some really tough decisions that are going to have to be made. And that, of course, then will affect talking about culture going forward. And although things have kind of changed really quickly under this crisis situation we're in, I think it's going to take a longer time to build things back up and for us to feel that this is the settling of all of the cards that have been thrown in the air. So yeah.
So there's a lot of dilemmas in this, isn't there? There's the need to almost move the pendulum back towards what does the organization now need? And in some cases, the organization will need teamwork and problem solving and innovation, which may not be brilliantly delivered remotely, that you may need people physically together, not just to spark off each other, but actually to build the relationship and the trust to enable innovation and problem solving to happen. And that's more difficult to do in a remote context, isn't it? And so will we see this pendulum swing back? You know, I'm reminded of lots of Facebook posts that I've seen over the last year of people receiving hampers and gifts from their employer, well-being packs, etc. And will we see them moving away from that and more into, okay, we still have a business to run, we still need to innovate, we still need to solve problems. And do we need people physically back in the office, or how does that happen?
Yeah. And I think picking up on that, a really important point is for people to remember that, I oft-used quote, you know, work is something I do, not necessarily a place that I go. And, you know, sometimes I think it would be really helpful, particularly now, for organizations to be reflecting on, if we're going to bring people together, why do we bring them together? So it's really looking at the added value of bringing people together so that people can be allowed to perhaps work virtually or remotely on pieces of work where they require concentration, where they, you know, want to be in an environment which is quiet, where they need to focus. And we know from a brain perspective that that time is important for people as well. But actually, when they come together, it may be more around sharing of knowledge, higher levels of creativity, bringing teams together for team building or increased energy. So really thinking about, you know, where people are is probably based on what it is that we need them to do. So if we want people to be creative and innovative and share knowledge, then bringing them together is the right thing to do. But if we want people to be really productive and focused on something where they need to concentrate, then actually they don't need to be in the office to do that. They could work remotely. So starting to really think about the future of work within your business and what are the behaviors that you need people to display might help figure out where people need to be.
So that culture becomes much more driven by the organization requirement rather than, in some cases, the sort of bricks and mortar or the beanbag approach to culture. That there's a more fundamental question to ask around, what do we need now? Do we need innovation? Do we need problem solving? Do we need focus on productivity, as you say? Okay. Interesting discussion. I think we'll come back to this over the next couple of weeks. I think there's lots and lots to talk about. So please add your comments, get in touch, let us know what you think, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.